I'm going to start by reading a poem by Cree and Métis researcher, scholar, and writer Kim Anderson in a chapter that she wrote for the book collection Until Our Hearts Are on the Ground, Aboriginal Mothering, Oppression, Resistance, which is a book about Indigenous reclamation, resurgence of traditional birthing practices, especially as we know in Canada, even as recently as the 2000s and to today, there's a lot of obstetrical violence against Indigenous women and others who are giving birth. So in this chapter, she writes about her own experiences with the birth of her children, and I'm just pulling up the poem. That first one is the one that cracks you open, where you break through sound barriers, enter the thunder of relations, carry the future, become creator. In a worldless trance, I floated on the ceiling one moment, struggled for grounding the next, stretched thin and wide, he stubbornly holding back, methodically placing his arrival in the world. I woke silent, hearing that first breath, a little squawk, eyes clenched tight, rounded face like a monk, quietly greeting, breathing small, rapid bits of heaven into our new universe. I have been twice blessed. My little joker, making sure I paid full attention, made me wait, knowing all about timing, delivery, performance, wrapping anticipation with humor, layer upon layer in that dance, screaming, both the duet of an announcement, she halfway out, her tiny head twisting and churning to take us all in, me, enjoying the singular chance for explosion. So generously spilling out imaginings, she arrived. There are dancers and there are singers in this world. We need them both. I have been twice blessed. So on that note, I will introduce our poet for tonight, Adrienne, who has written this beautiful poetic kind of memoir called Q&A with Book Hug Press about her experience with birth, parenthood, the topics that we're exploring today. And then we've also invited Catherine Mellinger, who practices as a perinatal mental health therapist in my hometown of Waterloo. And perinatal means all throughout the process from conception through pregnancy, postpartum. That is a word I personally did not know until I went to medical school. And both of them, Adrienne and Catherine, have their own personal lived experience, which they'll be talking to. And Adrienne, of course, will be speaking to her work as an artist through poetry, and Catherine as an artist through her collage-based practice. So I will pass it on to you, and I will stop sharing.
I think what our plan is.
Yeah, so what's our plan?
Okay, so I think our plan, so Catherine and I have not met in person, but we've known each other for some time. And we found out a very funny thing is that I was also born in Kitchener, or Waterloo. I was born in Waterloo before it
Yeah before the divide.
Exactly.
Weird
and
divide.
Then my family moved to Saskatoon when I was 8, so I grew up there, and Catherine was born in Saskatoon. And I don't know when you moved. Were you an adult when you moved?
I was an adult when I was a parent. I was a parent when I moved.
Big deal. That's a big
deal.
Yeah. So we did this flipping of
we flipped sides of the country. Yeah.
And although now I'm on the West Coast, I should say, I live on the unceded territories of the Squamish Nation. I'm specifically on a very small island called Bowen Island, which is about a 20-minute ferry ride from West Vancouver. So that's where I am. Catherine, did you want to say anything before?
So when I was told that I was being paired with Adrienne, I was like, oh, this is perfect, because we've been following each other, like not just geographically, but like on Instagram, and I've been following your work for a while. I was just really excited to get to do this, and I'm now in Waterloo, which is part of the Haldimand Tract, so home to the Haudenosaunee, the Neutral, and the Anishnaabe people here. So yes, different, all from sort of different different lands.
Mm-hmm.
Should I share? I can share
Sure,
my
yeah.
screen if that works.
Yeah.
Because you so kindly put together the outline.
I had to structure it somehow because I was like,
No, it
how are
was
we
so
doing
helpful.
this?
Yeah, I will also add that I'm actually doing this call from my bedroom because I'm on day 4 of 5-day isolation with COVID. So there may be children whose voices can be heard. Hopefully not.
I feel like that would be very fitting for tonight.
It would be very
if your
fitting.
children
It
come in,
feels
I think that's
very
definitely
fitting. It feels very fitting. But just to sort of preface that and I may also like yawn quite a bit because I've been lying down for like the last 4 days. But
I'm so into this. I might yawn, just sleep deprivation. I have 3 children. Like it's
let's
the
just
struggle is
yawn
real.
collectively for all of the parents who are not sleeping.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think kind of what we had in mind is that
Yeah.
I was going to talk a little bit about my book and read a few pieces and then turn it over to Catherine, and she's going to talk a little bit about her work, and we're just going to kind of pass it back and forth a little bit. But I will say, Catherine, if you do want to jump in whenever at any point when I'm like, please feel free. We can, doesn't have to be too regimented.
Okay. We'll ping pong.
We can ping pong. That sounds good. So yeah, the pairing of this is lovely. I feel like my book is so, I'm just going to hold it up. This is what it looks like. It's got birthing kind of imagery inside the Q and the A. This book is so specific because it is about my eldest daughter's, my pregnancy with my first child, her birth, and the postpartum period, kind of the first 4 or 5 months afterwards. So it is basically a memoir in poetry form. And my daughter's name is Quintana. And so the Q stands for Quintana, the A stands for Adrienne. It also stands for this idea of questions and answers, and how the things that we sort of question when we go down this road of bearing children, essentially. But also I feel that throughout the book, I have some quotes between her and I, some conversations that we've had. And so often she's kind of providing me with the answers. So it's kind of a play on all kinds of things. The book itself is sort of structured so that the first section is a lot about pregnancy. And I'm going to read a few poems. What am I doing here? I'm going to read, the first poem I'm going to read is from the first section. And I did a lot of, after I had Quintana, I was obsessed with birth and with that process, with pregnancy, what it does to the body, how it changes you psychologically, physiologically, in every possible way. And so I started reading just anything I could get my hands on. And I came across some very interesting, very old literature, old sort of medical literature around how women should conduct themselves during pregnancy. And I mean, we've been hearing this kind of thing forever, and we still hear it today in all kinds of ways. But this first poem I'm going to read, it's a found poem. So for those of you who maybe don't know about found poetry, basically that's any kind of text that a poet will lift and kind of move around and shift to create a poem. So often it might be like a news article or quotes from somebody else or something like that. But in my kind of reading, I came across a document written by a doctor in 1902. And the title of the document, it's called Ladies' Guide in Health and Disease, Girlhood, Maidenhood, Wifehood, Motherhood. And it's essentially what I think of as the what to expect when you're expecting from like 100 years ago. So I'm going to start with this poem, and it's called Hygiene of Antenatal Life. The special influence of the mother begins at conception. Mothers transmit piety to their children in larger measure than fathers by a proportion of nearly 3 to 1. Anger, envy, irritability of temper should be held in check. She should cultivate cheerfulness of mind, calmness of temper, and avoid excitement of all kinds, such as theatrical performances. Her husband must encourage her to resist such tendencies through interesting conversation, reading, and various harmless diversions. Mothers are as likely to transmit their enfeebled mental qualities to their sons as to their daughters. Stock raisers appreciate that blood has market value and don't ruin animals by allowing them to propagate freely. The haphazard way in which we generate humans leaves no room for surprise that the race should deteriorate. As I was sort of processing this first birth, I became very sort of obsessed with the ways in which women have historically been treated in pregnancy and childbirth. And I mean, those things are still happening today. And of course, I'm a white cisgender woman, so I am getting the best treatment that there is. I'm very privileged, but there's all kinds of subtle and not so subtle ways in which anyone who's pregnant and having a baby is, you know, potentially undermined or mistreated, or just has just really poor care, maybe not obvious to others, but just isn't treated in the way that we should be. But I found out some very kind of horrifying things as I was doing a lot of the reading that I was doing. And I knew about twilight sleep. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with twilight sleep. But I knew about it, but I learned more about it as I was reading. And twilight sleep was something that was championed in the first sort of half of the 20th century, specifically by white feminists. And it was essentially considered to be a miracle pain relief for women during childbirth. And part of why it was pushed so hard by white feminism is that there was this idea that the pain of childbirth was considered God's punishment to women for Eve's great sin. And so women were obviously championing against that and not wanting to have to go through horrible pain just to have a child. So when twilight sleep was sort of invented, it was seen as this amazing feminist, pain relief option. But what a lot of people didn't realize or didn't fully understand is that it wasn't that twilight sleep, it's a combination of scopolamine and I hope I'm saying that right, and morphine. But it didn't actually take away pain. It took away the memory of the pain. So women would wake up after having this twilight sleep, and they would have no memory of the experience. They were handed a swaddled newborn and left with this idea that they had had this empowering birth experience. But what kind of came out over time was that, there was in some ways, it was quite a sort of horrifying experience, because women often had to be restrained, sometimes in straitjackets, sometimes tied to their beds so that they wouldn't lash out and hurt doctors or hurt themselves. So it turned out that feminists weren't really fighting for painless childbirth. They were fighting to forget childbirth, and the pain that goes along with it. So when I learned about that, I became really fascinated with it. And so I wrote this piece, which I will read. And this is called Better Birthing Through Chemistry. Blindfolded and strapped gurneyed in my own shit, the room dark for hours or days, arms cast in leather thongs, straitjacket mummy. Labor is for the mentally ill. Outside the hospital, pregnant women line up for their injections. Scope blooms with morphine, ticking time bomb. Upper class women formed twilight sleep societies. Quick prick and narcosis complete. Rabbit hole plummet into black forest. Blue tinted rooms, eyes bound. Oil-soaked cotton nests stuffed in ears so I won't rouse to my own screams. We go a little crazy, don't we? Alkaloid, belladonna, deadly nightshade. Each seductress straddles hips and writhing belly. Best not to fight. Rectal injection, the burn of babe in arms. Emerge, smooth vulva, ingrown pubes. We wanted it then, still do. Bell-shaped flower temptress. We have our dignity. Sucklings, fresh and slick. Bliss when we don't remember. I'm gonna read one more and then I'm gonna turn it over to Catherine. This last piece that I'm going to read right now, it's called Streptococcal, and it was another one that was sort of born out of a lot of reading that I did. There were, before antibiotics were invented, and I cannot actually remember the date on that, women were at really high risk of infection and dying sort of post-childbirth. And that wasn't specifically a surprise to me, but what I found shocking when I read it was that a lot of women, I think some of the statistics I saw were on the low numbers were sort of 25% of women were dying of childbed fever back in sort of the late 1800s. And the reason why was because at the time, doctors were not taught that it was necessary to wash their hands before performing vaginal exams during childbirth. As a simple intervention, and that's in ending up creating, bacteria in the body. And then as I read further, I found out that you would have physicians and medical students who would be practicing obstetric exams on cadavers and go from the autopsy room right to the delivery room, and of course not washing their hands, and nobody wore gloves back then, right? I believe the doctor who ended up pushing for hand washing and that level of sanitizing was ridiculed and ostracized so badly that he ended up in a psychiatric ward. But eventually, when it became clear that evidence showed that washing hands like highly reduced the spread of bacteria, then those death rates decreased dramatically. But I remember reading about that, and I found it so horrifying that that's kind of where this piece comes from. So it's called Streptococcal. Typically, fever struck within days of delivery, followed by sharp pains that radiated from the belly upward. Autopsies revealed thick, fetid pus suffocating the ovaries, uterus, and abdomen. New mothers rotted away, as if birth itself consumed them. In 1836, a doctor blamed rotten breast milk that leaked downward rather than out the nipples. Dead mothers reeked the stench of rotten milk. His unwashed hands, a beacon of his prowess. Others blamed constipation, new mother anxiety, or cold air gushing into the open cervix. Women were giving laxatives, enemas to drain toxins, chloride douches to cleanse the birth canal. Barber surgeons favored bloodletting, encouraging leeches to suck out the bad blood. Sometimes bugs crawled up the vagina and were lost in the womb. At the Boston Lying In, doctors gave women excessive doses of quinine to fight the fever until their ears rang like a never silent church bell. The sudden cessation of pain, the fatal symptom. Most died within a week of delivery, their putrid remains lined along the rooftop to air. So that's my sort of very long start. That's half of, like, I have a lot to say. I have a lot more to say about those poems than the others. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, I could listen to that all day. There's a lot of noise coming up the stairs too, so I'm just really conscious of that with my kids like getting ready to go to bed. Thank you for sharing those. I think this is why, so I'll give a bit of background on myself. So I am a perinatal mental health therapist. I come to that field because of my own personal experience in having my children. But I also very much come to that work as an expressive arts therapist. And so to me, art is sort of paramount, and a way of dialoguing through art with my clients is paramount in terms of the work that I do. So yeah, I just thought I would share a bit more. And I think part of why I love the work, I mean, part of why I love your work, Adrienne, and other people who can write about their experiences, because to me, it's like the research that can go into some of these poems are essentially the cultural research that's often what I am helping clients do for themselves to understand their own experience. And that's why I sort of put, okay. I don't know what he said, but so yeah, so to give a bit of background, as an expressive arts therapist, I'm trained to work intermodally with my clients. Traditionally, art therapy has been divided into categories. So art therapist, dance therapist, music therapist, drama therapist. And in the 1970s, when a lot of other things changed, so did the field of psychotherapy. And people began to think about this notion of intermodality and how we can offer clients a more relational way and a more playful way of accessing art in therapy, which is where expressive arts therapy came from. So I will sometimes work with my clients in poetry, in words, in story, as well as all of these other modalities that can be available to them. Part of what I bring then in terms of my lens to my work is I very much do come from a feminist approach. And I don't say that gingerly, because we're discovering a lot about feminist movements in particular that have been quite oppressive in the past, and that have also been very exclusive. And in the world of therapy, in terms of the feminist approach, it's really kind of pushing the boundaries of how we view someone's role in the world as being quite important to how they view themselves as a person. And so part of what I also do as a therapist is work from a relational cultural perspective, which means it's not just up to you to fix yourself. It's looking at all of the factors that are at play. And very much when I'm working with people in the perinatal period, it's helping them to understand the system in which they're giving birth, and everything that comes with that. So, you know, in hearing, when I was reading this book, Adrienne, and looking at like how much research went into these poems, those are the types of things that I'm really allowing and holding space for my clients to discover for themselves in terms of like which system they're actually birthing in, which, you know, can be a very patriarchal, misogynistic system still for many, many, many people. And so I love art for that, that we can find these sort of constructive ways and these beautiful ways to hold stories and hold very painful stories in a way that can be quite beautiful. I will often allow my clients to borrow poetry books from my office, like Adrienne's book, so that they can see themselves in someone else's work. And offer them other people telling their stories in order to help them tell their own from different perspectives. So I feel like I'm sort of going off on a tangent, but which is all to say that anyone that I have met who is a perinatal mental health therapist, and anyone I have met who does work from the perspective of parenthood, is doing so because we have a story that we need to tell that has not had space to be told in the world yet. And that's what sort of keeps me doing the work that I do, and keeping my interests where my interests lie, in terms of using my training. And even in my art, I've become sort of, over the evolution of my artwork, I've always spoken of mental health in my work. I came to parenting with a pre-existing mental health condition, which is not something that was at the time heavily researched at all, other than to say, from a very ableist perspective, consider very strongly if you want to do this or not. And so I've always spoken of it, but sort of subtly. And as I've entered into the world of perinatal mental health and further along in my children's lives, I've become more and more and more obvious and loud with what I'm talking about, in my artwork, and also a stronger and a stronger advocate for the people that I work with, in terms of really having them be able to strongly share stories that they really, really need to share. Yeah, so that's a bit of background in terms of what I do. I'd be happy to answer more specific questions later, but I just really, which is all to say, in this presentation, I felt like it was really important to leave Andrea space to read the poems, because to me, that's what my work is about people finding these really beautiful ways to tell their story, because they have not been able to tell their story previously, and oftentimes just don't have the words either. Which is why that sort of expressive arts avenue has been so helpful. And you're going to read some other poems, and then I'll talk a little bit more about sort of like metaphor. We sort of matched up some themes, Adrienne and I, in terms of what surfaces the most in the work that I do with the clients I work with. And metaphor is a very powerful one. So maybe, Adrienne, I'll let you read those poems, and then I can talk a little bit more about metaphor.
I almost tried to unmute you. I don't know what I was doing. Okay. First of all, I just have to say, like, I loved what you say about story. And I think when I was working on this book, it was a therapeutic experience for me. It was a cathartic experience for me. And even after I'd written the poems, and my friend Brecken Hancock, who's also a writer, she was my editor, and she's a and like absolutely fabulous. And multiple times over the course of a year, I would spread out the manuscript on the floor and sort of move things around and do that kind of physical work with the book. And the process of editing these poems and revising them felt like tearing off my own skin. Like, it felt like peeling off my own skin, and I'd never had that feeling before. And I think the reason why is because even though a lot of these poems are not directly about my personal experience, they are things that I read that I feel like are connected to my personal experience of birth. Even though, I mean, I had three sort of very very straightforward home birth. So in many ways, I was quite privileged. I had very few interventions. A lot of the traumatic stuff that I talk about in this book did not happen directly to me, but what I learned throughout kind of processing my own birth experiences, not just the first one, but for my other two kids as well, was that I had trauma from my first birth because of how terrified I was. Not because anything went wrong or anybody was in danger or any of that, but I was thrust into this completely different world, and I did not know that was going to happen. So I'm gonna read a couple poems about sort of the aftermath of that. I also have sort of mental health struggles, and so I was quite worried when I became pregnant that I would get postpartum depression. I was very aware of that. I had a psychiatrist that I worked with And I didn't end up getting postpartum depression, but I definitely struggled. Well, I'll get a little bit more into that in a minute, but this piece I'm going to read, it's from sort of later on in the book, and it's essentially just about those sort of early postpartum days where everything is kind of a haze. And you don't really know what time it is, and you don't really know what you're doing or what's happening, but you just know you have to feed this infant. And in my case, I was chest feeding, I was breastfeeding. But you know, whether you're feeding from a bottle, whether you're feeding from yourself, it's such a strange time. It's very otherworldly. So this is called Supply and Demand. Dennis goes back to work. I lactate. The midwife listens to your tiny beat, jots down weight before and after feeds. We eat dinner. You sleep in the bassinet, the first and only time. My spine is fused to pillows piled in a throne. Udders leak and mix with drool. The cat sleeps on your face again. We trance in stupor. I wet the bed with my tits. No one wakes with us at night. My brain ossifies by the flush of bedside lamp. My breasts are boulders. I feed you at 11:46, 2:11, 4:18, and lose track. Our bedroom is a dumpster. Used diapers, takeout containers, granola bar wrappers, breast pump. Postpartum is the sewage system of a shrunken world. You splay my chest, starfish. Milk wastes under your weight. My stomach is a flaccid blueprint of your past life. Vacancy sings, it was a good harvest. You pat my belly, the old stomping grounds. I'm just going to read one more right now and then turn it back over to Catherine. This next piece, it goes into a little bit more of my experience, of my postpartum experience in terms of mental health. Probably a lot of you, or maybe a lot of you have heard of the term baby blues, which is a very cutesy way of describing a really horrible thing. I didn't have postpartum depression, but I definitely had the baby blues, which for me meant that every evening at 7 p.m. for the first several weeks after I gave birth, I would sob and sob and sob to my partner and tell him I was terrified about him going to work the next day because I didn't know how I was going to get through. Ironically, the days were actually okay for me. My eldest daughter was born at the end of January, and we were living in Vancouver at the time. And so the weather was pretty mild. It wasn't raining a lot. It was actually pretty nice weather for the first several weeks after she was born. So I did a lot of walking. I had her in a carrier. I walked a lot. But in the evening, something about the darkness and the shift of time made me just suddenly feel, and I'm sure sleep deprivation was a part of this, but made me feel very alone. And I knew that I was going to be going into the bedroom to sleep with this baby who was not sleeping very well. And so I felt this sort of sense of desperation, and I was quite anxious during that time period. This poem is actually written, it's about, I don't know if you can see this, it's in haiku stanzas. So the haiku form is, a short 3-line form with 5 syllables, then 7 syllables, then 5. And I wanted to write it in this form to give these sort of snippets of what that feeling was like for me. So this is called Haikus for Baby Blues. Don't worry, experts coddle. You should be able to just shake it off. Like clockwork, each night, our cramped apartment houses a collective howl. You arrived from my erasure. I haunt our shared bedroom. Leave me here. I post a photo of tiny fists to please my antsy followers. The baby blues is not an illness. Think mood swings, hormones in transit. My placenta left a hole. Progesterone weeps from me as you nurse. My therapist says, fear is a bird that searches for a place to land. Okay, I'm gonna pass it over to Catherine for a bit.
I love that piece so much. Yeah, I mean, I feel implored to say, like, because I also provide perinatal mental health training in my community, it's amazing how many people don't realize that the baby blues is experienced by 90% of people who give birth. And we never really, I help a lot of people process that because it's intense. Like, you know, when you say like a cutesy term, it's like, it is very cutesy, but when we really stop and think about the process that's actually happening for someone, in that their body is going through the process of realizing that they're no longer making a baby is like incredible to me, right? When we think about how much our bodies actually go through in the process of carrying children. And I'll preface this by saying that I also work with people who are not birthing parents. And within the perinatal mental health work, there's some really positive neuroscience that's starting to come out in the field that's really starting to understand that your brain can go through a chemical process of change and an increase of vigilance, even if you aren't the birthing parent, even if you're an adoptive parent, even if you're the partner to a parent, that we can go through those chemical processes. The thing that's fascinating about the baby blues is that it really is about the body realizing it's not growing a human anymore. And if we really think about that as like animals and human beings with bodies, you know, like it just blows my mind, really. Like it blows my mind what our bodies go through. And the reason I say that is because that really is leaning on that sort of, if we lean on that relational cultural theory, it's like, oh, people do this every day. Like, you know, when you're born with a uterus, it's like, well, eventually I'm sure you're going to have babies. I'm sure you're going to go through this process. Like it's part of what your body does. We really underestimate the process, the biological process that people are going through. And I say that from society, like from a societal standpoint, we really underestimate what happens, you know, like we grow an organ for 9 months only and then evacuate it from our bodies. Like not everybody can do that. So I really think with a lot of my clients, it's like embracing the intensity of what they realize that they've just done, that their bodies have just done. I support that very often with my clients. I did want to speak about metaphor, but I also just want to speak about trauma for a little bit, because Adrienne, you brought that up. And I think, you know, that's something that's really important to me, is very oftentimes we like to define what a traumatic birth is. So a lot of times, you know, I'll have clients who will come to me and say, well, somebody told me my birth sounded traumatizing. It's really not up to a system to define what is traumatizing. It's really up to a person, right? And so like you were saying, Adrienne, you can have these beautiful, picturesque home births, and it can be intensely traumatizing, like what your body is going through and the realization of your body having been through that experience. There can be other people who have a cascade of medical interventions and end up with emergency cesarean sections and babies in the NICUs and would not define that as traumatic, right? And so within the field of perinatal mental health, what I find really fascinating is deconstructing like who's telling us what is a trauma and not a trauma, because there's so many other complex factors to that. And even for people to say that they didn't feel traumatized by the experience until a birth worker or an obstetrician said, well, you know, I apologize for that traumatic experience, or like brings up the term trauma. So I think it's just really fascinating and important for us, like for me as a practitioner, to look at, you know, somebody will contact me and say, well, I want to process my traumatic birth. I'm always going to stay curious about whether that birth was defined as being traumatic by a system or whether they themselves actually identify that birth as being traumatic. Sometimes that is the case, that they truly did experience that as traumatic. But there are also cases where people don't understand why their own birth would be described to them as traumatizing when it wasn't to them traumatizing. It really sets people up in this sort of medicalized way of like, you are broken because of this. And it really sets us up to also fear a lot of things about birth, rather than actually like emotionally prepare ourselves for the process, really. And so, you know, just to kind of put that in there, because it's so interesting to me how we've allowed a system to identify what trauma is instead of an individual who's actually experiencing it. I didn't feel that my first birth was traumatizing at all. And it wasn't until I was actually recovering from the birth and had the physical sensation of the birth, because I had a epidural with my first. It wasn't until the epidural wore off that I experienced a physical traumatic event in my body that was reminding me of previous injuries. That's what made that process traumatizing for me. The birth itself was not the trauma. And so it's just really important for me as a practitioner to get really curious and dive in about that. And I guess to tie that back to like imagination and metaphor, very often if I can get my clients to talk more metaphorical, more sensorial, use words that are like juicy and decadent and really are based on like a sensory experience, then we can get emotional response to those sensory experience and this decadent, juicy way that they can describe it, where they're able to realize like another side of that experience, or they're able to get really specific. Like I was able to get with support about like, oh, it wasn't actually the birth. It was that physical realization of what my body had gone through at the hands of people and the baby and all that. That was what I needed to heal from, not actually the whole of the birthing process. So metaphor can be really, really liberating for people, because it's a way for them to kind of tell the truth in a way that they feel immediately forgiven for, because they're not telling the truth. They're just providing you this metaphor that builds a sensational experience, but it can bring them to this place of like being able to feel like they have told the truth, like they can get closer to what feels like truth, if they can describe it from this really imaginative sort of sensory experience. And it's just very amazing to me how that I sort of often feel like the work that I do visually is kind of a visual metaphor, in terms of like I'm telling the truth, but I'm doing it through like clouds or these other like pieces of pictures. So I guess that's like a backhanded way of tying it back to metaphor, but it just felt really important. My like perinatal advocacy brain sort of lit up when you talked about like, yeah, just like I had these picturesque home births, but like we don't know which part of a birth. We tend to kind of say like it was a traumatizing birth. It's like there are so many things that happen in the process of birth and the stages of birthing, that to say like an entire birth is traumatized, there's so much there to deconstruct. There's so much story and layer of story there, that if I can get my clients to even just discover like little bits of that through some imaginative, explorative way, you can start to kind of pick that apart. Because from the start of having labor to like having a baby, that's a lot. There's a lot of birthing that's happening there. There's a lot. And so we often just kind of use this term like birth, but we negate how complex of a process that is, and how many different things are happening in that process for each person that's going through it too. Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to say I love it, because I'm often holding people's pain that way, but I love being able to get people curious about their own experiences, and metaphor helps do that. If we can talk from a more decadent, imaginative sort of perspective, they can actually get curious about something that psychologically they're actually terrified to go back into. So if you can do it through this kind of fun, playful way, we can actually start to sort of chip away at the story a little bit. yeah, I have so much to talk about with like perinatal mental health. So let's do more poems. I feel like I could talk about perinatal mental health for hours. So more poems.
Well, I feel like I could listen to you talk forever. I also feel like I could have really used you after that birthing experience.
You can
Because
still use me now, Adrienne.
I might. Well, the funny thing is that my other two home births that I had were not traumatic. But the third one I had was frustrating and irritating because I expected the third baby to just kind of, basically
Pop
fall
out.
out. And no, it was really long and took forever. And she was in a weird position. So sorry, I'm gonna get a bit graphic, but like it took me like 3.5 hours to push her out, and I was like, what the fuck is happening?
Yeah.
But yeah, it was that first birth that really just blew my mind open. And I think actually something that struck me as I was listening to you talk, Catherine, is I think that's what I was doing in this book, because the truly graphic poems in the book are really the ones that are heavily researched. And I think that I was using that because I wasn't ready to talk deeply about my own experience in that way, but I sure related to all the stuff I was reading, even though none of that happened to me. And I didn't have, obviously, but anyways, it's interesting. I think I have a better idea of what I was doing subconsciously, apparently. It's funny because I'm still, I have a book of essays coming out next year, and there's a lot of birth in those essays as well, although more of the essays revolve around sort of parenthood and motherhood and that type of thing. But I definitely haven't really been able to stop writing about that. And I, yeah, it just seems to be my bread and butter. I don't know what the deal is, but
yeah,
you're right. I mean, we could talk about it forever.
Yeah. Well, and if I can interject too, like you made me just realize too the story of the tropes, right? Like, oh, it's your third one, it'll pop out, no problem. Like all these really disgusting tropes that we have around birth, like your body knows what to do. Like we can name so many, and I use those very often with my clients too. Like, let's talk about all the tropes you've heard, all of the assumptions that your family has passed on to you, culture's passed on to you, all these things. Oh, your hips are so wide, you're made to have babies. Like so many, right? There's so many delicious tropes to just dig into, that are all just so discriminatory and like so against our bodies, and just put us in this position, as people who have the capacity to give birth, put us in this position of just like being a factory almost, like, oh, well, you've got the great hips for birthing, or like, oh, you've had 3, you can just pop them out. Like, oh yeah, I'm just going to wake up tomorrow morning and have given birth to a baby. Like, I don't even need to try. But there is such a strong, you could do a whole poem just using tropes because
for sure.
There's so many tropes surrounding birth. And and just even for clients to just dig into that can get very playful very quickly, because they suddenly realize like, oh, that's just some ridiculous thing that people say. It's not who I am. It's not my experience. It's not what I experienced. It's not what I'm experiencing. And then you can sort of allow people to observe the tropes and observe the messages of society, rather than actually feeling like they have to live them. Because if they don't live them, then they're a failure. And sort of it allows like society to be put at a distance a little bit and be able to say, yeah, like all those crazy things that happened in the 19th century, like it's truth. But it's a story that we can look at and learn from. So we can look at these tropes and say, F you trope, because that's not me. But we can gain some distance from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here's a question. Do I have time for another poem? Because I don't know how, I know this goes for an hour, but I wasn't sure. Miriam, do you want to?
We usually go for about like 10 to 15 minutes over the hour. So if you want to read one last poem, or I think you guys have 2 slides, and we can open up for a question or 2.
Oh, do it though. Read your poem.
Okay, I'll read it.
Beautiful.
Okay, so this poem basically sort of takes you through the story of the birth, but in a very condensed way. So this is my sort of story, and it's called "Flood the Ocean with Your Breath." 1. I come first, heady with drink, sunstroke, pure hedonist, I'll ravage. I get what I want. We swoon in afternoon sweat, binge ourselves. He mimics his drunk spunk, the water inside me, a medium. 2. Belly grows taut, first try. In nematodes, sperm cells crawl rather than swim toward the her cell. Spawn in darkness. Amnion fills with fluid. I am your cavity. 3. I will claw his fucking eyes out. All fours, amoebid, unsightly. I beg to have you yanked out, quick as a loose tooth. Leave me sterile. I don't care. Instead, waters pierced. I pickle. 4. My debut into motherhood, polycephalic, as you pause, half in, half out of me. Born, but not born. Ethereal between bloody thighs. Hard push, you dredge up along my shore. 5. I shower off blood and bravery, but who was brave here? I prayed for a surgeon's salient hands and weaponry. My organs slide into place. Your head rests on my belly, waterbed. 6. Chafed from confectionery milk and sweat, I want for everything. Howl from the bedroom suspends in chronology. Night after night, I plunge, subaqueous. 7. For days, your head smells like me. I transform from hero to her. Consume my afterbirth to ward off voices. Balm for baby blues. Captivity leaves us, heartsick, waterlogged. 8. Sweet Rue, how do I find you? How do I rid myself of you, sweet meat? Your father by himself in the other room. Is he sorry? Am I? An ocean between, and your life raft is me. Thank you.
Love that piece. Excuse me, my voice is starting to fade. I'll just touch on embodiment because we had sort of talked about this. When I read your book, Adrienne, what I was really touched by was something that people often come to me with as clients is like the question or the goal of becoming the owner of their own story again. And very often, and I say story very loosely because a lot of people say, I want to feel like my body is mine again. And that can be a very layered experience in terms of all the stories that get compounded onto our bodies when we have children or give birth to children. So it felt like as I was reading the book, it was like your process of owning your own experience again. And that's so common for people that I work with is like, how do I, and sometimes I'll work with people in pregnancy as well. And sort of like, how do I stay the owner of my experience? Or after birth, like, how do I re-become the owner of myself, the owner of my experience? And so there's a lot around, I love to work in embodiment with people as well, in terms of just how they even feel in their bodies in the present moment, because there's something that can break so easily when you suddenly have someone who's depending on your body for survival. You can very quickly just not picture your body as a part of yourself anymore. It's just this machine that's doing a job, and it's leaking everywhere, and or it's not leaking, which is its own stress, or it's bleeding, or it's not bleeding, or it's like, you never know if it's doing the right things. And so a lot of what I work with my clients is that sense of ownership. And if we can become owners of our own bodies again, then we can also become part of owners of our stories. Or if chicken and egg, or if we become owners of our stories, then we can start to become owners of our bodies, and that we don't need to get rid of our children in order to become owners of our bodies again, either, because that's sort of a trope concept of like, oh, once you detach your child from yourself, oh, once they sleep by themselves, once they're eating by themselves, once they're whatever, like we push children for independence. Part of that is because we don't know how to own our own bodies anymore. And then we've become so disconnected from owning our own bodies that like we think that our bodies have to be singular in order for us to own them again, when we can find a way to embody and like own our own bodies and our own stories while still having our children attached to us, still being the machine that provides them with this place of comfort and this place of home. So I work a lot with embodiment with my clients, and also just ownership of self, and that they can trust themselves again. Because I think for a lot of people in the birthing process, like I think in our society right now, to come back to that relational cultural theory, there's a lot where we're seeing like, we don't, and this is very much also from the patriarchal medical system, is like, oh, don't you worry, we'll just take care of this. We'll just make your body do the thing it needs to do. And so a lot of people will say that they just very much felt like they were never taught to actually trust their body in the process of birthing, in the process of having children, that we're told that we have instinct for it. We're told that our bodies know what to do, but we have never actually experienced that. And then when you are in a medical system who sort of says, don't worry, we'll take care of it, then we also just don't trust that we'll ever really know. Like, so a lot of times I work with people and just trusting themselves again, trusting their bodies, trusting their story, trusting their perspective. There's a lot of people who doubt that what they feel about their experience is valid. And so a lot of the work that I do is helping people understand that no matter how they feel about their experience, that's valid because they feel it. But there's this kind of lack of trust of like, well, I feel it, but I don't know if I should be. Well, you feel it, so it's true, right? So yeah, I when I was reading your book, I just loved that there was like this process where I was like, oh, like she's owning it. Like there was this process of ownership that was really deep to me, because that's what I hope for all my clients, is that they can be owners of their own stories, that they can trust themselves again, that they can know that like they're the masters of their own story. It's not anybody else's story. It's theirs, it's their child's. It's like a whole process of being like, right, I am a capable, strong person who knows. I know what my child needs. I know what I need. I know what to believe and not to believe about myself, about this process, about who my child is. So there's a lot in the work that I do that just comes back to being able to trust ourselves again. And and often that's through embodiment. Again, I feel like I could go off on tangents for hours about this stuff because it connects to so many things. So many things.
I'm loving listening to it, honestly. And I feel like you're giving me ideas of work that I want to do in the future.
That we could do together. Yeah. Yeah, it just connects to so much. I mean, I also, transparently will say, like, I'm a mother who lives with mental health issues. I have children with special needs. Like, it connects to so much, like all of this, birthing, raising children. It just connects to so many other things in this world that we isolate it. We're like, oh, you're done having your babies. Well, it doesn't end. Like, it's just, it's just interconnected to so many things, So in society, we treat it as like, oh, you have your birthing years,
Yeah.
or like your family
Everything is
raising
very
yours.
compartmentalized. Even, I mean, I
Exactly.
noticed when I asked my mom what her experiences were like, she can barely remember them. And for me, it's like all like
Yeah.
I've spent
Yeah.
years thinking about this stuff, and
Yeah.
we're not taught to value it either as a process, and a
No.
process that goes on
Yeah.
like, because we're forever changed by this, obviously.
Yeah. And it's set up that way as well, right? Like in the world of perinatal mental health, like postpartum is set up as a very specific window, right?
Yeah.
So it's the first year.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of clients who are like, well, I have a 3-year-old. Can I still see you for perinatal mental health? And I'm like, are you permanently affected by the process of having children? I don't care if your kid's 12. To me, that's still perinatal mental health.
Mm-hmm.
But we categorize things and it's very much because of the system, right? Like we can't, nobody's going to fund postpartum support for 12 years.
Right.
They're going to fund it for 1. So we compartmentalize, but it's really not, it's impossible to do that. It's just a continuum. Yeah. Anyways, people might have questions and we could just go on forever.
I just want to thank you both again so much for taking the time to do this. Adrienne for tacking it on to what I'm sure was already a busy day teaching. And Catherine for mustering up the energy while in bed with COVID and having to deal with kids around that.
This just gives me energy to talk about this stuff.
Amazing. And yeah, I learned a lot as someone who, wants to go into mental health care.